Follow the path laid out by the paper, but I was very grateful to Larry Bush this morning for an initial piece of business that was very necessary, and that is taking care of the lexical problem with the term neoliberalism. Obviously, he didn't try to solve the problem, but he reminded us that one difficulty in studying it is its instability. That there is no permanent, agreed-upon definition of the term, and it's a term that allows you to sort of take an argument where you want it to go. Something of the same thing is true with the use of the term disrupted these days. It sort of came on the scene in education only sort of 4 or 5 years ago, largely a result of the influence of Clayton Christensen, the Harvard Business School professor, who had introduced the term a decade before into the vocabulary of schools of business. I'll get back to him in a second, but I did want to set out just set out the lexical problem and offer you two definitions of disrupted that are actually very important to this paper as it goes along. There is a limited definition of what disrupted means when we talk about a disrupted university, and actually Christensen is best associated with the more limited idea of the term. That is, what he has in mind is the disruption of a corporation. So a disrupted university, and what he proposes, it's a simple idea, and it's best represented in the example he uses most often of the impact of the Asian car companies on Detroit. I mean, they devised a cheaper, simpler car. It was the bottom end of the car market, and sooner or later they caused a lot of the problems in the auto industry as they began to improve their product, and the major car companies ignored it and focused on what they had been doing for a long time. There are other industries now to which he applies that argument, and the idea took off in corporate life, and then about only 4 or 5 years ago, he began to apply it first to higher education and then to public schooling. So you could hardly go to a higher education conference where somebody, if it's not Christensen himself, isn't speaking about disruption. So the limit, and he has introduced disruption into the vocabulary of higher ed criticism, largely allied to the benefits to be derived from online teaching. The online teaching has the place of the sort of small car that the auto industry model suggests. So a disrupted university, in this more limited definition, is one that recognizes the need to reorganize itself according to cost-saving measures in teaching and learning, probably in the introduction of, primarily in the introduction of online courses and programs. And that's what a lot of institutions understand disruption to mean. And in Christensen's book, the sort of text here is Christensen's book from 2011 with Henry Eyring, a thick book from Jossie Bass called The Innovative University. And it's organized around a contrast between Harvard and BYU Idaho, of all places. Christensen's a Mormon, though. He relies a lot on Mormon institutions for his example. And BYU Idaho is presented as an example of an institution that almost from its beginnings accepted a big role for online teaching and learning, which led to certain ways in which they organize the faculty, the way the whole place is financed. So it's an institutional example he relies on. And the image he has of the disrupted university is one institution after another recognizing these facts and reorganizing itself financially to lower costs and be more efficient. But there's a second definition of disrupted that's equally important right now and is circulating with somewhat more power these days. And it's what I would call sort of an extended definition, and it addresses more than the situation of the individual institution or campus. This use of the term suggests that the problem is the institution of higher education itself. So disruption will yield an entirely new format for post-secondary teaching and learning, freeing students, wherever they are, freeing students from the conventions of courses, credit hours, and diplomas. Instead, an open system, largely online, will support autonomous and customized learning to be recognized in new forms of credentialing, like the Mozilla badges, let's say. The classic text this month is the one that came out only a couple of weeks ago from Kevin Carey, the Chronicle of Higher Education writer, called The End of College. I'll talk more about it later. A good chunk of the paper is devoted to Carey's new book, The End of College. But an earlier text, very similar, from 2010, it's Anya Kamenitz's book, DIYU, which represents the same conception of the disruption of the whole of post-secondary education, not just a single institution. So I think it's important to keep in mind these two sort of complementary or side-by-side ways of understanding what disruption is all about. And in the paper, I actually look at both of them. So I've organized this in 6 parts. It begins with attention to what I call the view from Cambridge, which tells the story of the interest of the MIT faculty in the consequences, long-term consequences as they saw it, of the open courseware project that MIT launched in 2001. Now, the open courseware project is actually the sort of, that's where the genesis of the MOOC is. It's no accident that MIT has a big role in the MOOC movement, because it amounted to, in effect, a conversion of the big open courseware project that they had launched about a decade before the MOOCs hit. I find fascinating about the understanding of the long-term meanings of the MIT project is what they assumed would happen to the faculty if the open courseware truly caught on, largely in the form of the better organized full course that we associate with the MOOC. And luckily, we have a record of the MIT faculty's speculations on this regard in the minutes of meetings and in the MIT faculty newsletter, which is a terrific resource to understand the sort of the mind of the MOOC maker. And what they were contemplating, even before MOOCs had a name, was what they called the certificate school. So I just want to read a page from here to give you a feel for what this is like. Even before MOOCs had a name, when they were simply a form of open educational resources, that's what the Open Courseware project was all about, the faculty pioneers at MIT were speculating about what they meant for the future of faculty work. They looked ahead to what relations would be like between a group of prestigious research institutions and less well-known and suitably deferential colleges and universities. Down the line, these are renamed producing and consuming institutions, with MIT being in the producing group. And thus, much of the formal coursework for a degree anywhere would be the responsibility largely of the former, that is, the prestigious institutions, while the latter would be delegated local educational tasks supporting the online high-status curriculum. If all goes well, according to the MIT faculty, many smaller universities would become what they talked about as certificate schools, or institutions granting post-secondary credentials based on successful completion of MOOCs and demonstration of certificate-worthy competencies. This is how such an institution would advertise itself. This from actually the guy who was the president of the faculty senate at MIT about 4 years ago. What he imagined was the way a certificate school. Now keep in mind here, I've kidded colleagues, I don't know where the line is for the certificate school. We're not too far above it, right? Right here, in the way they think in MIT. Here. But the certificate school would be something like Saginaw Valley, let's say. That's the kind of institution that would be transformed in this way. And this is the way it would present itself. We help you learn from the best and brightest from all over the world. You learn physics and computer science from MIT, philosophy and Sanskrit from Harvard, art history from Yale. All our faculty, now, this is the certificate school speaking for itself, all our faculty live within a 5-minute walk from the center of the campus. And here he identifies their tasks. They are always around to help you through the rough spots, to learn with you rather than teach you. In effect, they're demoted to advisors and sort of high-level mentors. Now, with the global subject catalog dominated by star performance, academic work would be reconfigured in this highly stratified manner. And he says that this is the first real improvement in academic productivity since Gutenberg. Just 2 or 3 years later, Daphne Kolar, as she was launching Coursera, put the same sentiment this way. Let's say, she said, you're stuck at some no-name state college in the Midwest. Now, where could that be? Let's say you're stuck at some no-name state college in the Midwest. Now the top 10% of students at that school have the option to take a Coursera course that could open a door to being employed at companies like Google. So the view from Cambridge of what the disruption would be like would entail a reorganization of the institution of higher education, but still based on the idea of the brick and mortar institutions. Most of the curriculum would come online. but colleges and universities would survive as these certificate schools or mediating institutions, but the role of the faculty would be completely changed, be organized around a deference to the producing schools. These new ones would be the consuming schools. Oddly enough, it didn't take a year or two for one of the chief spokesmen for this idea to be William Bowen, of all people. And I'm moving to the second part now, on the part called Sand in the Wheels. This section is largely about William Bowen's efforts between 2012 and last year to promote this idea. That is, they no longer, he never used the phrase certificate schools, but he took up this new form of stratification in what has to be called a campaign to reform higher education. Now, Bowen was the president of Princeton for a long time, then the president of the Mellon Foundation, with enormous authority in the higher education community, the author of a half dozen very widely cited books on higher education. But he became the spokesman for what I call the view from Cambridge here. And he outlined his thinking in Higher Education in the Digital Age, which came out in 2013. And he became the favorite speaker at what's called the Coursera Partners meetings. Now, that's a group. That's the annual meeting of the group of producers who, from the launching of the MOOC movement, set out to reorganize higher education along the lines that Bowen was speaking of as he traveled from higher education meeting to higher education meeting. There was, as the idea began to express itself, of course, it attracted, as faculty members in different parts of the country began to see what the producing schools were thinking, it attracted some opposition, and that's what he referred to in a sneer as sand in the wheels. The examples I use are the effort at the community colleges in San Diego to resist the forced use of MOOCs in the curriculum there, and the better known episode at San Jose State University in the philosophy department there, where there was a big controversy of the president's insistence that they incorporate one of the first edX or MIT Harvard-based MOOCs into the curriculum. Then I explain those episodes. Bowen dismisses them as simply sand in the wheels and opposition that those who have seen the future can simply ignore as things change. Instead, Bowen turns his attention to the governance system. And in the third part of this paper, he suggests, if you can see how he gets to this, that if the faculty is unwilling to cheerfully change, that is, to accept new roles, that is, more online teaching and more acceptance of the uses of MOOCs in hybrid formats, he did make a single concession. Coursera did also. That is, backed away from the idea that MOOCs would be installed complete into the curriculum, and he and Coursera began to promote a hybrid model. The Ithaca group, which Bowen is still very close to, supported an elaborate project at the University of Maryland, the University of Maryland system. They had 7 institutions working with adaptations of MOOC resources. It was all Coursera resources. This was a big step for Coursera because you can't take a piece out of a Coursera course. It's whole or nothing. But they allowed the faculty in the University of Maryland system to experiment with using parts of the Coursera courses as if they were actually open educational resources. But the results there turned out to be very mixed. There was no difference in student performance, and the economic benefits, were for the point of doing the whole thing, became a source of considerable dispute between Bowen and independent economists who looked at what he claimed were the savings and found them to be negligible. So what kind of a disruption they turned out to be is an open question right now. Bowen, though, had moved beyond the Maryland experiment and has dedicated himself to a change in governance. What he wants to do, he says the problem with faculty administrative relations is that tradition has given the faculty too much control of how they teach. He's not interested in what they teach, but he thinks we're at the time now when the conventions of academic governance have to be redrawn so that the administration can impose online or hybrid formats on the faculty as a cost-saving device. Now, of course, this is a pattern that would be applied to the consuming institutions, not to the producing institutions. They're not going to do this at Princeton or at MIT or here. So it's, again, a highly stratified approach to how disruption would work through the governance system. And that's what I use a phrase a phrase of his when he turns to the necessary organizational machinery to get the job done. To make his point, he does something astonishing and rejects a sentiment that in an often quoted passage from Clark Kerr's The Uses of the University, when Kerr was in most ways a big supporter of the faculty. He loved the oppositional faculty at Berkeley, and he called an oppositional faculty a balance wheel in the university. Bowen puts that aside, and he says, we no longer can afford that. What we need is organizational machinery to tame the faculty and to get them to do what's necessary to cut costs. So that's what the section on cheerful change and organizational machinery is about. In the fourth part, I turn to the Coursera effort to, in effect, compromise its program. I use Bowen as an example of coercion, that is through the governance system. But Coursera, you have to grant Coursera some credit in an effort to convince the faculty that this would be a good thing to do. The centerpiece of their effort to do that is the agreement they struck 2 years ago with 10 state university systems. Those enroll about 10% of all the students at public universities. And the idea there was to offer Coursera courses for hybrid versions of the faculty courses at these institutions. But of course, the whole point was to bring the MOOC into, get the nose under the tent in that metaphor, bring the MOOC into the curriculum and not incidentally produce profits for Coursera, because the universities would in effect license the new courses and pay fees on a student-by-student basis for these hybrids because of the use of the Coursera, the Coursera resources. And the difference between the two, the different elements of coercion and conviction, though, are even evident in the Coursera project. I look at two documents from the Coursera effort. One is their what they call explanation of usage models and supporting platform tools, in which they produce a short document aimed at the faculty to try to show them how productive it could be to take the Coursera online resources to produce hybrids which would save money. By the way, the single thing that Bowen and Coursera believes is behind cost savings by using online resources and MOOCs is cutting down on faculty classroom time. And if Bowen calculates things that actually show you can save in classroom time and capitalize on the contingent faculty phenomenon by reducing the faculty by 10% in departments that adopt this policy. But there are economists who say that it's illusory, those savings. But the effort is what I'm trying to capture here, the difference between coercing and convincing. On the other hand, Coursera is trying to convince the faculty, but there's a 45-page contract that each state system signs with Coursera that is regulation to the max. It specifies everything about what a faculty member would have to do, and most of it is divided into how the financing of it would work, and what the state institutions are going to owe Coursera as a result of faculty participation in this. What's astonishing is that there isn't any evidence from any of the websites of any of these institutions that any faculty members have embarked on these new courses. What the faculty members have done is use the agreement with Coursera as a backdoor into the Coursera platform for their own MOOCs. These are all state systems that didn't have the status to be accepted by Coursera as full partners. Instead, they're positioned on the website as affiliates here. But the project allowed faculty members at Kentucky, say, to become authors of MOOCs, and several have at each of these institutions. But there are no buyers yet in the hybrid program, which would produce the income for Coursera. So they're stalled in this effort. But I thought it was fair to recognize that while there's a strong element of coercion in what's happening now, with the joining of the MOOC and disruption, there has been some effort to work with the faculty on this as well. The fifth part of the paper is the one in which I address Kevin Carey's new book, and it carries the title Broken, Unbundled, and Reassembled, because those are favored terms of the Silicon Valley venture capitalists and entrepreneurs who carry a doors. This is astonishing to me. Most of us have been reading Kevin Carey for years, the Chronicle. He heads the higher education program at the New America Foundation, and I find him a very compelling writer. For example, he's one of the few critics who finds the great flaw, the fault in college athletics is in the fans. And he says, and he's written terrific pieces on, they're the ones who deserve more public attention for supporting the growth of athletics, the alumni and the fans. But in any case, Carey has given himself completely over to the Silicon Valley venture capitalists according to that second definition of disruption of higher education. That is, the overturning of the whole system. And the end of college is about the substitution, ultimately, of what he calls the university of everywhere for the conventional institutions. And what that amounts to is a little like what Andy Kamenetz was imagining 5 years ago. That is, students would cobble together or assemble or aggregate something like a degree from all thousands of independent online providers, including the MOOC providers, but without regular institutions. Carey is convinced, as many venture capitalists are, that there would be thousands of providers springing up to offer experiences in online environments of various kinds. That's why a lot of the leadership of Silicon Valley is very hostile to the idea of the diploma and to traditional credit instruction. What they're trying to do is open the space for a very different understanding of what post-secondary education would mean. It's not about disturbing the activities of a single institution that is putting in more online courses here to save $250,000. That's nothing to them. They look at a $500 billion market in education, and what they want is us to all go away and open up the space to autonomous, independent action by students. So Carey is smart enough to look at the question of the end of the faculty, and he says simply, it's going to be, get this, in this phrase, a hard fall. Fair enough. It will be a hard fall, and he's not afraid of anticipating, hundreds of thousands of unemployed faculty members. That is, there would be new roles for them potentially, working independently or affiliated with new kinds of credentialing institutions that come up. But he's pitiless in this regard. Paper ends in the conclusion with attention to two competing images of how the faculty might respond to these new images of disruption. The first comes from Clay Shirky, the NYU media professor who writes online a lot and has been, he published a couple of books. He's a true believer in all social media and everything about them. He's been promoting them for the last few years. He's been one of the forces behind the legitimacy, such as it is, of crowdsourcing, for example, and everything. And Shirky's really smart. He's no fool. But he refers to but he's only contemptuous of those editorial writers in the Chronicle of Higher Education and elsewhere who are unsympathetic to technology and supporters typically of liberal education. And he refers to them and their habits as Teamsters in tweed. And the image is perfect because what he wants is to stigmatize them as sort of old-fashioned union members. It's a version of, what was the term from a few years ago, about limousine liberals. Oh, yeah. The idea is the same. This is a group that is relatively comfortable, that's the tweed part, but they're preparing themselves to behave like Teamsters. It's simply oppositional, with hardly any interest in taking up what's possible via technology. And I set that side by side with a suggestion made by Michael Lever, an economist at NYU, who speaks from the producing side of things and presents himself as very sympathetic to the uses of technology. And what he proposes is accepting it, and he says, riding the tiger, making the best uses of it. But of course, he sees things from the same perspective as the faculty at MIT. There will be producers and there will be consumers. Where this leaves us, unlike everybody, I'm like you this morning, I don't know what, there's no simple way around this here. That is, no formula for what I call at the end sort of acceptance and refusal at the same time. And I find myself, those of you who I know here know, I like to say I teach with technology and against it at the same time. And I know that sounds impossible, but I think it's doable in setting out a syllabus and informing relations with subject matter and with students and with colleagues. Whether this is possible in the much higher stakes game of the organization of the whole institution, I don't know. And I wish I could point to some good examples of faculty members and, more important, institutional leaders who have found the spot between, thinking like a Teamster and thinking in terms of riding the tiger. But we don't have that yet. On the other hand, I would say it's still very early. The MOOCs are only 4 years old. It's incredible. It seems like they've been around forever. So there's time yet to figure things out. Whether there's the proper leadership in place, I'm not so sure. So, did I make the time?
Yeah. Good enough, Steve.